Today is August 5th, 2009. I'm interviewing Mary Ann Thurman of Honey Grove, and this is Jacqueline White of the Fannin County Historical Commission. Mary Ann?
My name is Mary Ann Thurman, and I was born Mary Ann Evans in Dallas, Texas, December 17th, 1937. I was an adopted child. I was born with the birth name of Patricia Ann Pye. But my parents adopted me when I was 8 weeks old through Hope Cottage in Dallas. And my parents were Mr. and Mrs. Lon B. Evans, Lon B. and Lottie Bell Evans, who were business people in Honey Grove at that time. So they came to Dallas, and Mother always said she picked me out. I don't know that that's true, but it always made me feel good that she picked me out from the babies at Hope Cottage. And they brought me back to Honey Grove on February 2nd, Groundhog Day, 1938. So we've always celebrated my second birthday on Groundhog Day, because to Mother, that was the day they got me. So I was lucky enough to have two mothers and two birthdays. And I grew up in the house where my son now lives. It's still in the family. It was an older home there in Honey Grove on 14th Street, 1106 North 14th. And I lived there with my parents. And my father and mother worked in Evans grocery store. My father's parents were S.B. and Ethel Evans. And my grandfather started this grocery store in 1932, I believe it was. The building was on the northeast corner of the square in Honey Grove, and it had originally been the Planters National Bank building. And in 1926, the bank closed. And 1929, there was a fire in January that burned some of the buildings on the north side of the square, but it didn't destroy the bank building, it just damaged it. And my grandfather had already started the business at one point there, and another building, I guess. I really don't know where that was, but he bought the Planters National Bank building. And from pictures I've seen, there were steps leading up to the door of the building, and it was a one-story building. My grandfather took the floor down to ground level and made like a second story and put in the first elevator in Honey Grove. It had pull cables that you would pull up to go down and pull down to go up, and it had like a wire cage around it, and that was fascinating to me as a child. And I grew up literally on the square in Honey Grove because Mother and Daddy worked in the store a lot with my grandfather. My grandfather was really a good merchandiser. I have a picture at one time where he filled the whole front window with peppermint candy at Christmas time, and I remember him telling me about getting in train carloads of flour and sugar. It would come on the railroad by train carloads. And the whole back end of the store was feeds, various types of feeds, because most of their business was with farmers. In 1948, my grandfather died. He had had a stroke right before that. He was on vacation in Michigan, and my grandmother didn't drive, and he had a major stroke in Escanaba, Michigan. And my two uncles went up there, and they had to bring him back on a stretcher in a boxcar of a train. That was the only way to get him home. And so he was paralyzed from that point on. And at one point, Mother and Daddy closed the house in Honey Grove, and we moved in with my grandparents that lived at 404 East Main, which was just off the square in Honey Grove. And that was not a real happy time for me, because we were living with grandparents with a sick grandfather, and we were all in one room at one point, and finally they let me have a bedroom upstairs. But I always had to be quiet, so it was not really a good time. And he died in 1948, which I would have been 11 years old, 10 or about 10 years old, almost 11. And not too long after that, we were able to move back to our home, and my grandmother was able to stay there alone. So we lived in this house on 14th Street and had neighbors all around. They were wonderful. I had a girlfriend that lived across the street that was about 3 years older, and we had lots of fun playing. Back then it was, we plaque. Instead of playing, we plaque, play like.
Oh.
Let's plaque. We're going to plaque. We're going to do this. We made little houses in the dirt, set up little miniature homes, and she lived in a duplex across the street. And I remember there was a cow over there. That's when Honey Grove had cows and chickens and things right in town. And the lady her mother would churn, and I thought that was the neatest thing to go over there and watch her churn the butter, because we had a grocery store, so all of our butter and bread and meats and things were purchased from the grocery store, and I wasn't that familiar with farm chores and farm ways, but they churned the butter, and the lady on the other side of the duplex made sauerkraut one time, and I remember us going in to visit her, my friend and I saw this horrible looking stuff in a churn on the back porch. It had mold all over it, and it was sauerkraut making, fermenting. So we had a lot of fun. Mother and Daddy the lot went all the way through the block, and so the back lot always grew up a lot with Johnson grass and stuff. And at one time, they bought geese and put back there. So we had geese. We had rabbits at one time in a hutch in the backyard, great big giant brown rabbits that Daddy would cook and I would not eat because they had been my pet rabbits. And then at one point he bought a sheep and a lamb and put back there, and the lamb was just a pet to me. In fact, I carried it up to my grandfather's house when he was still alive and paralyzed in a wheelchair, and I have a photo of me with this little lamb on the back porch with my grandfather. So it was a fun time to grow up in Honey Grove, and I attended Honey Grove Elementary School and graduated in 1956 from Honey Grove High School. And there couldn't have been a better time to grow up in Honey Grove in the 1950s. I mean, we never locked a door. I slept in a front bedroom right on the street. The screen door was the only thing between somebody walking in, and it wasn't even latched. You just didn't think of things like that. And I had a lot of friends. I'd walk all over town. We didn't have cars then, and I'd walk all the way across town. The Roberts House Hotel was on the probably 3 or 4 blocks west of the square off on Market Street, and it was run by the Scotts at that time. And I had a friend, Dan Scott, and so I would go over there. They had a croquet court set up out by the side of the hotel, and we would all gather over there and play croquet. And I had a friend, Edna Joyce, and we would get up on Saturdays and we washed our hair. We rolled it in little pin curls and tied a bandana around our head. That was a big production, Saturdays in Honey Grove. And so we would roll our hair and tie the bandanas around it, and then we would go to town Saturday afternoon while our hair dried and scout out things and see what was going on. And there was a cafe just east of the square on Main Street called the Main Cafe, and that was a local hangout for all the kids. And they had pinball machines and a jukebox, and the little jukeboxes at each table where you could put your money in and pick your song and play. And my favorite thing was going after school because I was starving to death every day and get a Coke and a bag of Fritos for 10 cents.
That's something.
So we would go back home then and get ready for Saturday night. Now, this was a big thing. Everybody came to town in Honey Grove on Saturday nights, and they would come early and park their cars to get a prime parking spot around the square. And then I don't know how they got home and got back, but they managed. And all the ladies and men would sit in the cars, and people walked around the square. It was just like a promenade. And they would stop when they saw someone in a car they knew and visit. And I guess they took turns sitting and walking and going, well, all the girls, we also walked. And we finally learned we could walk in the opposite direction because that way the boys could see us. The square was one way. So if we were going, we made it where the boys could see us. We could look at each other, not go the same direction as their cars. And of course, the boys would stop and we'd get in with them and ride around, go get a Coke. And that was really a fun time. And another big fun thing we did in high school was to come to Bonham State Park in the summer. And a friend of mine had an old Model A that she painted orange, which was Honey Grove school colors. And we would load up in her Model A and take the back roads somewhere east of Highway, well, it's now 56, it was 82 then. And we'd go through the country somehow and come out at Bonham State Park. And they had a pavilion, a swimming area, and the jukebox in the pavilion. And so we'd put money in the jukebox and dance. One of the favorite things I've never had anywhere else, they had a frozen banana with ice cream around it dipped in chocolate. And so that was my big treat when I went to Bonham State Park to eat one of these frozen banana things. That was almost as much fun as getting to dance with some cute boy. But it was just such a wonderful, wonderful time. There weren't things like drugs, and kids didn't, if they had sex with somebody, they certainly didn't talk about it. And it was just, you just didn't worry about anything. There was a time of, there was not really any world conflicts that much going on. Of course, we did have to learn about the bomb, the nuclear atomic bomb, and learn how to get under our desk at one point. And I guess the Korean War came along in there too, but most of the people my age didn't go to the service. And I dated several boys, but when I was a sophomore, this one boy asked me to go out, and he had moved to his school. He came to Honey Grove in the 7th grade, I believe it was. All the little schools were closing. He went to Dial, the school at Dial. He lived out there on a farm with his parents and his 13 brothers and sisters. And his name was Billy Ray Thurman. And I know people went to school with him. When I meet someone today and they'll say, "Hi, Billy Ray." I know that was someone that knew him from the school days, because now everyone calls him Bill. And he was born January 14th, 1937. He's 11 months older than I am, but for some unknown reason, his parents held him back and didn't start him to school till a year later from the time he should have started. I think they kept kids at home to work on the farm because they picked cotton and did all of that kind of thing, and the kids had to start school late every year because they had to get the cotton crop out before they could come to school. But I remembered him, and I hadn't paid a lot of attention to him because he was a country boy and I was a town girl. And I don't have too much memories of him. I think one time we went on a hayride in the 8th grade, and he walked me home from wherever, it was probably a church or school hayride, and he walked me home, but that was about it. So when we were sophomores, I went to the movie, and it was Tuesday night. And Honey Grove had 3 movies during my lifetime. The Strand was on the northeast side of the square, and it had pretty much closed down. I barely remember going to movies there. And then after the movies quit, they would have things like book reviews, and a Mrs. Rajabian would come and give book reviews, and people would pay to go in and sit and listen to these book reviews. The main theater during my growing up years was the State Theater that was on the east side of the square, more toward the south end. And I guess I went to every movie that there ever was because Mother and Daddy were busy running the grocery store. And like I said, I lived uptown in the store practically all the time. And I went to the movies, and I guess I saw every movie that came out. And then they built the Grove Theater, which was the big new theater on the north side where some of the buildings had burned that I talked about earlier. For years, it was a big hole in the middle of the north side of the square. There was a building on the west side, and my grandfather's grocery was on the east side, but there was just a big vacant lot with grown-up trees and broken glass and weeds, and Mother would always say, "Don't go over there and play, you'll cut your foot. There's broken glass in there." But then they built the Grove Theater, and the entrance was narrow that faced the street, and the main theater was really off the square. It curved around behind my grandfather's grocery store. And that's where, I guess by the time I got in high school, that theater had opened. And the first movie in that theater was Francis the Talking Mule. I'll never forget that movie, going to see that. And also the one time, maybe the second time I played hooky. I played hooky twice in high school, and I got caught both times. The first time Gone with the Wind came to the theater, and that was my favorite book. I had read the book before that as a teenager, so I didn't go to school that afternoon, and I went to see Gone with the Wind. And I remember the principal walking in the theater and getting me out. The other time I played hooky, I went with a friend to the rodeo in Cooper, to the rodeo parade, and we got called on the carpet about that too. But back to my husband and the movies. I came out of the movie on Tuesday night, and that was 12-cent night. And it was really not anything anybody had ever heard of, but everybody went because it was 12 cents. And there was Bill standing by my car, and by then I had a 1948 Chevrolet. I was a sophomore in high school, and Mother and Daddy had bought me this old 1948 four-door, two-tone blue Chevrolet with a sun visor thing across the front. And I said, "What are you doing out here?" And he said, "I wanted to ask you out on a date." And I was really surprised because I didn't know he paid any attention to me, and I really didn't like him. I thought he was sort of stuck up and conceited acting. And I said, "Okay." I said, "Why don't you just come in the movie and sit with me?" And he stammered around a little bit, and he looked down and he said, "I didn't have any money." He didn't have 12 cents because things were really tight. Coming from a family with 14 children, there was not much money. And I know his mother, they raised some pork along, and most of their meat was pork, but she made homemade sausage when they would kill hogs, and she had her regular customers that she would come to town and sell sausage, and that's how she made extra money for things the kids needed. But anyway, I felt so sorry for him because he didn't have 12 cents that I agreed to go on a date with him. And we dated a few times, and I remember very clearly, we hadn't gone out over 2 or 3 times, and we were stopped in front of my house. I was going to get out and go in, and he said, "I'm going to marry you someday." And I thought, "Well, you stupid boy." We were sophomores. Well, I guess he knew more than I did. When we were juniors, we became engaged. And that was a big deal back then. Mother and Daddy were not real happy. They had plans for me to go to college and marry a doctor and all that kind of thing, not some poor farm boy from south of Honey Grove. But we just fell madly in love, felt like we were just meant to be together from the time we dated as sophomores, basically. So we went through 3 years of high school just dating no one else. He bought me an engagement ring when we were a junior, and we married 2 weeks after high school. We graduated from high school. We married June 21st, 1956. And a funny story about that date, a lot of kids got married back then. It was just something you got out of high school and got married. Well, 3 girls in my class had picked the date of June 22nd to get married. Well, that wasn't going to work because we all wanted to go to each other's weddings. So one the boy she was going to marry was in the service, and he was coming in on leave, so she got to get the June 22nd date because that was the only time he could come in. Then I took the Friday night. I got married on Friday night before her wedding, and the other girl moved hers the next week on down the road to a Saturday. So we really had a conflict over all of us trying to get married at the same time. So we married 2 weeks after we graduated from high school, and 2 weeks later, Bill had been in the National Guard for a couple of years in high school, and they had to go every summer for 2 weeks to Fort Hood. So he left 2 weeks after we married and went to Fort Hood for 2 weeks. So that was an unusual start to a marriage. And my parents were pretty upset about me getting married. They were good about it, but of course they had saved money for me to go to college through all the hard times of the Depression, and stock market had crashed somewhere in there. They'd invested a little money and it hadn't done too good, but they had managed to have money for me to go to college, and I graduated as a salutatorian of the class, so I had a small scholarship there and chose not to go. All I ever wanted to do was get married and be a homemaker. For some unknown reason, I had a hope chest. I mean, I had cup towels that I had embroidered with every day of the week. I had a little pine box that my father had made for me. He liked to do woodwork as a hobby. And so that was sat at the foot of my bed, and it was full of everything in the world that you might need in a home when you get married. So we married and we moved. We were going to farm, and we rented a little place at Dial and moved in this little house, 2-bedroom wooden house. And my husband had some hogs during high school, and so we had hogs out in the barn. Stink, I thought that was the stinkingest thing I'd ever been around in my life. I had never been on a farm, and this was some really adventure to me. We had cistern water. We didn't have a well. We caught rainwater off the roof of the house. And I remember Bill looked in there one time and there were wiggle tails, little mosquito larvae swimming around. So then we started having to have water hauled from town. Mr. Odie Jones was the water hauler for Honey Grove. He hauled water to people like us out in the country. And as a wedding gift, a lady across the field from where we lived gave us 6 chickens, but they all flew back home. She was so close they knew where their house was, so they all went back home. And one man gave us 2 sheep, I believe. Dick Self, he was a sheep rancher out north of town, and they ran off to Sulphur Bottom, so we didn't have too good a start. We had $27 when we got married, and if Daddy hadn't owned a grocery store, I guess we would have starved to death, but he let us charge the groceries. And that 1956 was a terrible drought year. Everything burned up. And we had some milo planted by the side of the house, and we had some cotton. And Bill put me out there at one point to hoe the weeds out of the milo, and it looked just like Johnson grass to me. And he came screaming out there and running out over there waving his arms. I was cutting all the milo down. I thought it was Johnson grass. And then we started to pick the little pathetic cotton crop, and I picked cotton for fun in school. I'd go out to a girlfriend's house, and I'd have a tow sack, as we called it, a burlap sack with a strap Mother put on it. Well, I thought if I picked that tow sack full of cotton, I'd done something big. Well, I got out there and had this big, long cotton sack, and I started we didn't pick it, we pulled the bowls, broke the bowls off. Well, those sharp bowls they have stickers on them. They stuck holes in my fingers. And Bill was just going right along, and he'd gotten over like 3 or 4 rows on ahead of me. And I remember it was hot, and I sat down and just started crying in the field. And he said, "What's the matter?" I said, "You ran off and left me." And he said, "If I waited on you, we'd never get this crop out." So we had some adventures, and about 2 months after we got married, I decided this is not going to work. We didn't have any money. His daddy had pity on him at one point and brought some of his hands to help get the crop out. So I started looking for a job, and my first job was in Bonham with Ray Peeler and Butler and Peeler law firm as a legal secretary. Well, I'm 18 years old. I had no experience, and I told them I didn't take shorthand, so I learned speed writing pretty quickly because they would dictate these deeds and wills and things, and I would have to try to get it down. And I think now, I wonder how many deeds have things wrong in it that I did when I was 18 years old and typing deeds for people. But I worked there 2 months, and I had applied at the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Office, ASCS office, and they called me to come to work there. So after 2 months, I went to work there. And I stayed there for about 2 years until I became pregnant with my first son. And I worked a little while, and I know my severance pay, my comp time that it built up, I got $250, and I bought a washing machine. And I thought that was the neatest thing. And when I got pregnant, I told Bill, I said, we have to get out of the country. We lived down a mud road at that time, and probably about 3/4 of a mile down a black mud road. And when it would rain, we would have to get up, and we'd bought a Model A. And so we'd hear the rain and we'd jump out of bed, and I would jump in the car and fly to the highway and leave the car, and he would come in the Model A and pick me up, and we'd go back to bed then until time to get up at 4:30. And by that point, Bill had to take a job, and he'd gone to work for the Lone Star Gas Company in Denison, so he had an hour's commute. So at 4:30 we would get up and get ready, and he would leave me with Mother and Daddy and go on to his work, and then I carpooled with people to Bonham to work. And finally, when I was pregnant, I said, this is not going to work. I'm not going to get stuck in the mud down here and have a baby. So we bought a little frame house on Walnut Street in Honey Grove and moved to town. And one of the funny episodes with the Model A, I was all dressed up. Of course, we wore heels and hose and suits and things to work. And we were going home that afternoon, and the front wheel fell off the Model A. Just ploop, off it went. And I had to get out and walk home in my hose, carrying my shoes with that mud squishing through my hose. And so that's about the time I decided we had to get out of there. And we lived in Honey Grove in that little house well, I was pregnant when we moved the second time. I have two sons, Steve and Todd. And when I was pregnant with Todd, we just had that little two-bedroom house, and we decided we needed something bigger. Steve was born November 21st, 1958, and Todd was born July 7th, 1961. So we moved, and it was an unusual move because we moved just east of Honey Grove on the Porter Allen place. And it was a big two-story farmhouse, and the lady there, Miss Lockridge, had just become a widow, and she wanted to move to town. So we traded homes, and we moved one room at a time, swapping out with each other. And we finally got down to the washers, and we just left them, and we left the TV antennas at that point because we were so tired of moving. And we tried to fix that house up, but it was not a very well-built house, and we figured out right quick after we redid the kitchen we were going to pour a bucket of money in it. So in 1973 we ended up building a new house in the backyard. And I stayed home with my children until they were 9 and 12. And by that time, all we were hearing about was women's liberation and women needing more fulfillment. Well, of course, I read all this, and I decided I needed to be more fulfilled. So I looked for a job, and I found a job at the nursing home. They had just opened it was called Grove Manor in the beginning in Honey Grove. And I applied for the job of activity director. And I think I started out making $1.25 an hour, and I worked 3 hours a day. And I had to bring my own chair and card table and put in an empty patient room for my office. So I started there, and then I worked on up, and it grew, and my hours increased till it became a full-time job. And I just loved it. I had more fun doing that job. I loved the people, and at that point there was not so much government regulation, and most of the people in the nursing home were people I'd known all my life, and they were more ambulatory. And we took them out on picnics to Lake Crockett. We just did all kinds of things. Every holiday we'd do special things. We came up with plays, and the whole staff dressed up and put on plays. And at Christmas, we had an elaborate production every year. We had an open house one time with Western Week, and we decorated at home with all kinds of hay and wagon wheels and drawings of things, and dressed up and had, I don't know how many people came, but that was a fun time. And then I had the opportunity to go to nursing home administrator school. I had a wonderful mentor there who was the assistant administrator, and then she was the head administrator, and her name was Marie Moran. And she was just a wonderful mentor to me and taught me so much. And so I went to Parish Junior College and took the nursing home administration course and got my nursing home administrator's license. We had to go to Austin and take this rigorous test that we were all just terrified about. And in 1971 to 76, I was the activity director and administrator at Grove Manor. And then in 1980, 76 to 80, I was the administrator at Birchwood Manor in Cooper. because that was owned by the same company. And then 80 to 83, I was the administrator, came back to Honey Grove, and I was the administrator at Grove Manor, and then I was regional supervisor over 2 other nursing homes. And 1983 to 85, then I was supervising 6 nursing homes. 3 of them were in West Texas, and I'd have to fly out to Lubbock or Amarillo every month or so and rent a car and tour around out in those godforsaken roads and try to find these little nursing homes to see about. And finally, they had an opening in Van Alstyne they couldn't fill, and they stuck me over there as administrator, and that was a horrible drive. And my mother died January 1st, 1985. I had just not been over at Van Alstyne too long, and she was found dead in her bed at home, and that was just really a big crisis period for me. And I was so stressed out, I finally just quit that job, and I said, I can't do this anymore. So I came home, and I stayed home a couple of months. And Richard Voyer, who had the Hall Voyer Foundation in Honey Grove, he called one day, and he said, I need a secretary, a part-time secretary. And I said, I don't know about that. I said, I had a secretary. I said, I don't know how good I would be at that. He said, just come up here and see. So I went to work for Mr. Voyer. And it wasn't long after that my husband, after he worked at the gas company about 2 years, and then when General Cable opened in Bonham, he was one of the first ones to go to work there. And in fact, his parents had to sign. He was 19 or 20. For some reason, he was under 21. They had to sign a sheet saying he could go to work. I never did understand that. But he had worked his way up into shipping supervisor from management, not General Cable, and that was another high-stress job. And he came home one day, not long after I'd started working for Mr. Voyer, and said, I quit. And I said, you can't have your midlife crisis when I'm having mine. But he did, and I thought we were going to starve to death for sure. But my hours increased working for Mr. Voyer as he became in more ill health as time went along, and I started learning more and more about what the Hall Voyer Foundation was and what it did. And I was assistant to the president, and then I was made a vice president on the board of not the board, but the foundation. And then Mr. Voyer died in 1989, and I was made the executive vice president of the foundation. And I think the foundation had about $2 million when he died as far as the capital that it had to operate. We operated off the interest from stocks and bonds. And I worked there for, until December 31st of 2007. Mexican food. As I said, I don't want to end saying Honey Grove was maybe looking its worst. It's just that I remember the 50s when it was at its height of its glory, and I guess it was really at its height of its glory in the 20s when cotton, or late 1800s when cotton was king and all the Victorian homes were built. But the 50s was a good time. But we have this new Mexican restaurant coming in, so I'm happy about that. And the dollar store does more business than anywhere in town, and we have a prestige store on the east side of the square. So there's always hope that things will turn around, and the economy's been so bad. It's just been hard for people to make a go in a small town at this time. But I have, as I said, 2 sons, Steve, and he lives in Forney, Texas, and is working from his home for an ag chemical company out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he travels all over the world, so I get to vicariously live through him on these foreign trips. He even lived in Tokyo for a year, so that was really exciting. And Todd, my youngest son, has a granddaughter, Brooke, that will be 20 in December, and she's going to Paris Junior College. And he works for the post office in Pottsboro, and as I said, he lives in the house where I grew up. My son lives in the house. My granddaughter grew up in the same bedroom that I did, so I think that's a really neat thing. And I feel very blessed to have been placed in Honey Grove. I feel like God had a big hand in my life the whole way it's gone. It just couldn't have been any better. Everything's been wonderful to me, and it's been a privilege to be able to